My husband drove to the storage unit on Route 7 every Saturday morning for 29 years. Rain, ice, the kind of February cold that turns your breath to smoke before it leaves your mouth. Gerald never missed it. When I asked why, early in our marriage, he'd squeeze my hand and say the same thing every time. Just keeping things organized, Ruth. You know how I am. And I did know. Gerald was methodical, precise, the kind of man who alphabetized the spice rack and color-coded the tax files. So I never asked again. I figured the storage unit was just another extension of the man I'd married, orderly, reliable, careful. I was a nurse for 32 years. I've held the hands of people in their final hours. I know what it looks like when a body decides it's finished. But when Gerald collapsed in the backyard on a Tuesday afternoon in September, raking leaves the way he did every fall, I wasn't prepared. Our neighbor Janet found him and called 911. By the time I got home from my book club, the ambulance was already in the driveway. Massive stroke. The paramedic said he likely didn't suffer, gone, before he hit the ground. I stood in the driveway for a long time after they told me. The rake was still there, leaning against the oak tree, a pile of red and orange leaves, half finished. Gerald would have hated leaving a job half done. The funeral was a Thursday. I wore the gray dress he'd always liked. People said things I don't remember. My son Michael flew in from Denver and stood beside me the whole time, solid and quiet. My daughter Diane came from Charlotte with her husband and cried in a way that made other people cry too, which I think is what Gerald would have wanted. He liked things to be felt fully. I cried later, alone in the kitchen at 2 a.m, sitting on the floor with my back against the dishwasher, which is a strange place to fall apart, but sometimes grief decides where it's going to happen, and you don't get a vote. 3 days after the funeral, I started going through Gerald's things. Not because I was ready, because a body in motion stays in motion, and stopping meant thinking, and thinking was something I was trying to manage in small doses. I found the key on a Thursday morning. It was tucked into the inner breast pocket of his winter coat. The one I was sorting to donate a small brass key on a plain ring. No label, no markings. I almost dropped it into the donation bag without thinking, but something made me stop. Gerald had a key for everything. Labeled keys. He had a pegboard in the garage with every key we owned hanging on labeled hooks, organized by category. This key had no label. This key had been hidden. I held it in my palm for a long time. I knew what it opened before I drove out there. I knew the way you know things you've been trying not to know for a long time. The storage unit on Route 7. Unit 14. Gerald had mentioned the number once, years ago, when we'd needed to store some furniture during a renovation. He'd said the unit was full. I hadn't pressed. I went on a Saturday, because that's when Gerald always went, and I wanted to understand what he'd been doing on those mornings for 29 years. The facility was called Secure Keep, a long row of orange roll-up doors with black numbers. I found Unit 14 at the far end of the second row. The key fit. I stood there with my hand on the door handle and thought about the 31 years Gerald and I had built together the house on Elm Street, the 2 kids, the retirement we'd planned to spend traveling, the way he still reached for my hand in movie theaters, even after 3 decades. Then I lifted the door. It was not full of furniture. It was not full of junk. It was an office, a folding table, a filing cabinet, 2 boxes of manila folders, and a banker's lamp plugged into a power strip. On the table, a legal pad with Gerald's handwriting. Notes, calculations, column after column of numbers. I stood in the entrance for a full minute before I could make myself walk in. The first file I opened was labeled Pemberton Active. Inside were documents I recognized. Gerald had co-owned Harwick Insurance Agency with a man named Dale Pemberton for 22 years. I'd met Dale at Christmas parties. I'd sat across from him at the agency's annual dinners. He had a wife named Carol and a son who played baseball. I thought I knew him. The documents in that file told a different story. Commission reports with 2 sets of numbers. One for the state insurance board, one that appeared to be the real figures. Client accounts that had been quietly overcharged for years. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger an audit on its own, but added together across hundreds of clients, across years, the number was staggering. I'm not an accountant, but I'm a nurse. I understand patterns. I understand when data doesn't match the diagnosis. I pulled out the second file. Gerald's name was on it. Just his name, not mine. A line of credit taken against the agency. $180,000. I'd had no idea. Our business finances, Gerald had always explained, were separate from our household accounts. I'd trusted that. Why wouldn't I? He'd been handling money since before we were married. Numbers were his language. The third file was the one that made me sit down on the concrete floor. Credit accounts. My name, my social security number. Signatures I didn't recognize as mine because I hadn't written them. 7 accounts, 4 of them still open. Combined balance, $54,000. I sat on the floor of that storage unit for a long time. Outside, a car pulled in and someone loaded boxes into a unit down the row. A normal Saturday morning, someone else's normal life continuing while mine rearranged itself entirely. At the bottom of one of the boxes was an envelope. Cream-colored, sealed, my name on the front in Gerald's handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it in my lap and breathed in and out, the way I used to tell patients to breathe when pain was coming and they needed to get ahead of it. Then I opened it. Ruth, I've been trying to find a way to tell you this in person for 3 years, and I haven't been able to. So if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm a coward. And I'm sorry for both things. Here's the truth. About 15 years ago, I found out Dale was skimming from clients. Small amounts, creative accounting. I should have reported him immediately. But he had leverage on me, a bad investment I'd made with agency funds without proper authorization, nothing criminal, but enough to cost me the business if it came out. He knew about it. So instead of turning him in, I became complicit. I told myself I'd find another way. I told myself I was protecting us. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true. Over time, Dale's operation grew. He needed money to cover the gaps when the scheme started attracting attention. He pressured me to contribute. I took the line of credit. I opened accounts using your information because mine were already compromised. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. I was wrong about that, the way I've been wrong about so many things. By the time you read this, we probably owe more than we have. The house should be clear, I made sure of that, but your credit is damaged, and the agency will likely collapse under investigation when Dale's scheme is eventually uncovered, which it will be. It always is. I've been going to that storage unit every Saturday for years, trying to document everything, trying to build a record that would protect you, trying to find a way to hand this to a lawyer without destroying what's left of our lives. I never got there. I ran out of time. I love you. That was never complicated. Everything else was. Gerald. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my purse. I pulled myself up off the concrete floor, locked Unit 14 behind me, and drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Michael was waiting at the house. He'd extended his stay, worried about me in that steady, practical way of his. He'd stocked the refrigerator and fixed the gutter that had been loose since spring. He took one look at my face when I came in the door. Mom? What happened? I set my purse on the kitchen table and told him everything. He sat across from me and didn't speak until I'd finished. Then he was quiet for another minute. He got a line of credit against the business, Michael said carefully. And your name on credit cards you didn't open. Yes, and he was covering for Pemberton. He was also covering for himself. Both things. Michael's jaw was tight. Does Diane know about the storage unit? No. I hadn't called her yet. I'd wanted to understand it myself first. We need a lawyer, he said. I know. He pulled out his phone. Let me make some calls. I let him. I went to the kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The leaf pile was still there, still half finished. I'd need to finish raking before the first frost. I thought about how strange it was, the way ordinary life keeps presenting its ordinary demands, regardless of what's happening inside you. The leaves don't stop falling because your marriage turned out to be something different than you thought. I called Diane that evening. She's always been emotional in the way Gerald was. She feels things completely, all the way through. When I told her about the storage unit, the credit cards, Pemberton, she went very quiet. Then she said, Mom, are you sure you're understanding the documents correctly? Maybe there's an explanation. Diane. I have his letter. In his own handwriting. She was quiet again. Then, Dad wouldn't have done this on purpose. He was trying to protect you. You said so yourself. He was also committing fraud using my identity. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. She hung up not long after. I wasn't surprised. Diane had always been closer to Gerald. He'd coached her soccer team. He'd helped her move 4 times. He'd danced with her at her wedding in a way that made everyone in the room smile. That person was real. The man in the storage unit documents was also real. I understood why she couldn't hold both of them at the same time. Michael called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Sandra Okafor, based in Burlington, specializing in financial fraud and elder financial abuse. We met in her office on a Wednesday. Clean space, direct manner, no unnecessary warmth, which was exactly what I needed. I told her everything. She listened without interruption, read Gerald's letter, reviewed the copies I'd made of every document in Unit 14. She sat back when I finished. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, your husband's situation is legally complex because he was both a victim of Pemberton's coercion and a participant in the fraud. The accounts opened in your name, that's identity theft. It doesn't matter that he was your husband. It doesn't matter that he said he loved you. The forged signatures are a federal crime, and there are avenues to dispute those debts and have them removed from your credit. What about Pemberton? That's a separate matter. The documentation Gerald compiled is actually quite thorough. It would be valuable to investigators. My husband spent 29 years documenting a crime he was afraid to report, I said. Sandra looked at me. That's one way to read it. Another way is that he was building a case he never had the courage to use. Some people find it easier to gather evidence than to act on it. Whether his intent was to protect himself, protect you, or expose Pemberton, probably all three. What he left behind is significant. Is there anything to salvage? She hesitated. Yes. I told her to proceed. The next 6 weeks were paperwork and phone calls. Sandra filed disputes with the credit bureaus, contacted the fraud departments at each of the 7 credit card companies, and subpoenaed Gerald's business records. She also quietly contacted the state insurance board, who were, it turned out, already looking at Harwick Insurance Agency. Dale Pemberton was already under investigation. Gerald's documentation accelerated everything. Diane sent a short email 2 weeks after our phone call. It said she needed time. I wrote back that I understood, that I loved her, that I wasn't going anywhere. I sent it and set my phone face down and went back to the documents Sandra needed me to review. It was Michael who told me, about 3 weeks in, that he'd almost lost everything too. We were at the kitchen table going through papers when he looked up and said, Mom, I need to tell you something. A few years back, Dad asked me to invest in a real estate venture with him. He said it was a sure thing. He said the return would be significant. He wanted me to put in my whole $401k contribution for the year, about $28,000. I felt the room shift the way rooms shift when something important is being said. Michael, I said carefully. Did you? Almost. He looked at his hands. Lena said no. She'd never trusted the numbers Dad gave us on it. She said if it was so good, why did he need outside money? We argued about it. I was furious at her for a week. I thought she was being paranoid. He looked at me with tired eyes. She saved us, Mom. I didn't see it at the time. I reached across the table and held his hand for a moment. Lena has good instincts. Do you think he was trying to use my money to cover the losses? I think by that point, yes. I think he was drowning and using everything within reach to try to stay above water. It doesn't mean he wanted to hurt you, but it means he would have. Do you think he knew that? I thought about the letter. About 29 Saturday mornings a year for 29 years. About all those drives to Route 7 to sit in a storage unit and document a mess he'd helped create and never figured out how to clean up. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, I said. I just don't think he knew how to stop. Sandra called me in early November with news on two fronts. 3 of the 7 credit card companies had agreed that the signatures were fraudulent and removed the associated debt from my credit report. And Dale Pemberton had been formally charged by the state insurance board and was facing federal wire fraud charges. His assets were frozen. The agency was dissolved. The remaining 4 credit card companies were harder. Their position was that I had benefited from the marriage and therefore bore some liability for debts incurred during it, even fraudulently. Sandra said, we would likely need to go to court. I said, fine. Tell me what to do next. I'd been looking for work since October. At 65, after years away from nursing, going back to the hospital felt like too much, too fast. I started looking at smaller positions. A women's health clinic near downtown Harwick was looking for a part-time patient coordinator, someone to manage scheduling, handle intake paperwork, explain procedures to patients. I went in for an interview on a Monday afternoon. The clinic director was a woman named Dr. Patricia Amara, probably 50, calm in the way that doctors who've seen a lot of pain tend to be calm. She looked over my resume. She asked why I was returning to work. I told her the truth. My husband died. I discovered he'd mismanaged our finances. I need income, and I need somewhere to be. She closed the folder. When can you start? I started the following Monday. The courthouse in Burlington was larger than I'd expected, all marble and echoes. Michael sat beside me. Diane hadn't come. She'd texted the night before. I can't, Mom. I'm sorry. I love you. I had replied. I know. I love you too. Sandra had spent 2 months building our case. The forged signatures, confirmed by a handwriting analyst, Gerald's own letter, admitting he'd opened the accounts. The documentation that the money had gone into accounts solely in Gerald's name, and then into the failing attempt to manage Pemberton's fraud. Not 1 cent had come into our household. The opposing counsel was a man named Whitfield, efficient and impersonal, who argued that I had benefited from the marriage across decades and could not now disclaim liability for its debts. Sandra stood up and methodically dismantled every part of that argument. Then she called me to the stand. Did you open any of these accounts, Mrs. Caldwell? No. Did you sign any of these applications? No. I did not. Did you receive or spend any of the funds drawn from these accounts? No. They went into business accounts I had no access to. Whitfield stood for his turn. Mrs. Caldwell, you trusted your husband with the household finances? Yes. You chose not to be involved? I trusted him. Those aren't the same thing, but you lived in the house. You drove a car, he maintained. You took vacations he planned and paid for. I lived my life. I didn't know the financial structure underneath it was built on fraud. Trusting your partner isn't consent to being defrauded by them. He paused. In 31 years, you never once suspected anything was wrong? I looked at him directly. My husband was organized. He was methodical. He had been handling our finances since before we were married. He had an explanation for everything, and I had no reason to question his explanations. I know that sounds like naivety, but naivety isn't criminal negligence, and it certainly isn't consent. The judge called a recess. Michael and I sat on a bench in the hallway and didn't talk much. Sandra checked emails. After 40 minutes, we went back in. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Caldwell, no relation, looked at the documents, then at me, then at both attorneys. The evidence in this case clearly demonstrates fraudulent activity carried out without the defendant's knowledge or consent. The forged signatures constitute identity theft. The funds were never accessible to or used by the defendant. I am ruling in favor of the defendant. The remaining credit accounts are to be removed from Mrs. Caldwell's credit report. The liens, if any, are released. Michael exhaled next to me like something had been held in for months. Sandra allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. I sat very still. I had won. I knew I had. But walking out of that building into the cold November air, I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt hollow in the way you feel when a long tension finally releases and there's nothing left underneath it. I had my name back. I had lost the marriage I thought I'd had, the version of Gerald I thought I knew, and maybe a daughter who was still deciding whether she could forgive me for telling the truth about her father. Diane called that night at 9. "Mom." Her voice was different from the last time. Quieter, more careful. "I'm here. I went to the agency offices today," she said. "Or what's left of them." I talked to Sandra's office. I asked if I could see the documents. All of them. She was quiet for a moment. They let me look. "Okay, you weren't wrong. Any of it." I could hear her breathing steadily, trying to stay composed. "There was one more thing, Mom. One more thing I didn't know about." "Tell me." "A credit card. In my name. Dad opened it 4 years ago. I never saw a statement. It went to a P.O. box. The balance is $17,000. Oh, Gerald, even now, even from this far away. Diane, I'm so sorry. I keep trying to hold both versions of him," she said. "The dad who taught me to drive and sat in the front row at every school play and called me every Sunday for 20 years. And this. The same person? The same person," I said. "People are more than one thing. The love was real. The damage was also real. We don't have to pick one." She was quiet for a long time. "Can I come this weekend?" "Of course. You don't have to ask." She arrived Saturday afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table with tea and went through the documents the way Michael and I had, methodically, calmly. She cried a little. I held her hand. We filed her fraud claims on Sunday evening with Sandra's help. Then we ordered pizza and watched an old movie and didn't talk about any of it for a few hours, which felt like its own kind of healing. The clinic became the shape of my days. I liked the work, the intake conversations, the scheduling, the way patients needed simple explanations given clearly and without condescension. I was good at it. Patricia told me in January that she wanted to make my position permanent and expand my hours if I was willing. I was willing. One afternoon in February, a woman came in for a routine appointment and sat in the waiting area with the particular stillness of someone trying not to fall apart in public. I recognized it. I'd worn that stillness myself. After her appointment, she lingered at the checkout window. I asked if there was anything else I could help with. She hesitated. Then, "Do you know anything about financial fraud?" "In a marriage?" I came around from behind the desk and sat down in the chair next to her. "I know quite a bit," I said. We talked for 45 minutes. Her situation was different from mine. Her husband was alive, and it was happening now, not being discovered after the fact, but the pattern was the same. Control that looked like care. Exclusion that was explained as protection, the slow erosion of her ability to see clearly. I gave her Sandra's number. I gave her the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which includes financial abuse resources. I gave her my own phone number. That evening, I told Patricia what had happened. She looked at me for a moment. "We get a lot of women in here," she said, "who need that kind of help and don't know where to start. Would you be willing to formalize it? Not therapy, just a resource list, a point of contact, someone who's been through it." I thought about Gerald's storage unit. I thought about the orange roll-up door on Unit 14 and the folding table and 29 years of Saturday mornings. I thought about sitting on that concrete floor reading a letter from a man I thought I'd known completely. "Yes," I said. "I think that's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." We set up a quiet corner of the clinic's waiting area with a rack of brochures, financial abuse resources, legal aid contacts, credit dispute guidance. Every week, I fielded at least 2 or 3 conversations with women who had the same stillness I'd recognized in that first woman. Some came back. Some brought their daughters. One brought her mother. Diane drove up from Charlotte once a month. Michael called every Sunday, which is something I'd learned from Gerald and had perhaps passed to my son without knowing it. On a Sunday in March, Michael told me he and Lena had sat down and reviewed all their accounts together. Every one, and made sure both names were on everything. She said she'd been wanting to do that for years, he told me. She just didn't know how to bring it up without it seeming like she didn't trust me. Does she trust you? Completely. But she said trust isn't the same as having access. And she's right. He's right. I know that now, in a way I couldn't have known before. Trust is not the same as visibility. Love is not the same as transparency. The two things can coexist. But one doesn't replace the other. Gerald loved me. I believe that without question. And he also kept me in the dark for 29 years in ways that left me standing in a storage unit on Route 7, trying to understand the shape of a marriage I thought I'd known. On what would have been our 32nd anniversary in April, I drove out to Secure Keep. I don't know why. Habit, maybe, or something like closure. Unit 14 was still there. I'd cleared it out months ago. Handed everything to Sandra. Donated the furniture. Returned the key to the facility manager. The door was someone else's now. A different lock. I stood there for a moment in the parking lot, in the early spring cold, looking at the row of orange doors. Then I drove back into town. Stopped at the new bank branch on Main Street, not the one Gerald had used, one he'd never walked into, and sat down with an account manager and opened a savings account in my own name only. Margaret Ruth Caldwell. Just mine. The account manager was a young woman, maybe 25, with efficient hands and a kind smile. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I thought about the women in the clinic waiting room. I thought about Diane's credit card at the P.O. box. I thought about Michael and Lena sitting down together to look at every account. I thought about the leaf pile in the backyard, which I had finished raking in October, alone, in the weak afternoon sun, because the job was half done and Gerald was gone and someone had to finish it. "Actually," I said, "do you have information about adding a beneficiary and a secondary account holder? I want to make sure that if something happens to me, the people I trust can access what I've built, and I want them to be able to see everything. No surprises. No locked doors." She smiled and pulled up the forms. "That's a really smart thing to do," she said. "I know," I said. "I learned it the hard way." If you're reading this and any of it sounds familiar, the explanations that close off questions, the accounts you don't have access to, the feeling that something is slightly wrong but you can't name it, trust that feeling. Not as an accusation, not as an attack, just as information worth having. Ask to see the accounts. Ask to understand the finances. If the person who loves you has nothing to hide, they'll be glad you asked. And if they don't want you to look, that's your answer. You are not paranoid for wanting to know the shape of your own life. You are not unloving for asking questions. You are not weak for having trusted someone completely. That trust was reasonable. What they did with it was not your fault, but you can protect yourself going forward. Start now, not after something breaks. Now, while everything still looks fine and ordinary and like the life you thought you had, I wished someone had said that to me 30 years ago. I'm saying it to you now. Don't wait for a brass key with no label to tell you it's time to look.